Hello everybody, welcome to Dungeons & Drams. Today we're going to be creating a fantasy race. Now I've challenged myself to create something kind of insane. So specifically, as you could tell by the thumbnail, I wanted to create a worm species of humanoids essentially. And the idea being I called them the Crawlorians. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take everything that I have in my brain about these Crawlorians and we're going to talk about their lore, their history, the mechanics of these, why is it good to be a worm person, as well as how these could fit into your D&D campaign. We're going to utilize what the DMG tells us that we should think about when creating a race, and we're going to utilize AI to do the parts of that we either are stuck on or find hard or just don't want to do. Now you can take this as far as you want to. You could use none of it or you could use some of it. But either way, walking through the process of creating a race is something I think could be useful to us all. So let's talk about how we're going to do this. We're going to go through 9 major points here, and all of them can be found on my Patreon as a public post, so you'll be able to see it no matter who you are, and you can just copy and paste it if you'd like to. And of course, if you're getting value out of these videos, it would be helpful to me to have you support. Why does your world need this race, and where do they live? What are their physical traits? What is their history? Are there any cultural or religious practices that stand out? Has this influenced their architecture at all? And what are their relationships with other races, specifically conflict or even harmony? Do they have any signature traits or mechanics that go along with this race? And if so, are there any optional subraces or variations that we want to consider? For the question of why does my world need this race? Well, the real answer is that I wanted to make a video based off worm people. But I decided to take it a little bit more seriously and think, okay, if I really wanted these, why would my world need this? And when I have seen in pop culture things like Critical Role, when characters or players are going down to the Underdark, they're usually following some sort of long tunnel. Now, sometimes this is, oh, this tunnel was made by a worm, or maybe it's just been there forever. But I started to think, I'm like, usually it's a long trek. A long trek through a deep, dark tunnel can be fun, and maybe the players need to, keep on their toes. But what if there was a town down there that was just suddenly filled with people that look like worms? Well, they could be a joke, or they could be something kind of cool. Maybe they have information. All of these things made me think, what if there's a town underground? And what would it be filled with? Worm people. Okay, so that's why I want them to exist in my world. I just want there to be something else underground. Doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. And this answers the question of where do they live? But if you really think about it, yes, they'd be more comfortable underground. However, even in real world, you'll see worms on the surface. So a lot of times they're dead on the asphalt, but you'll see them. And there's no reason that these worms can't be above the surface too. Maybe they need to be cognizant of being out of the sun. So maybe sunlight sensitivity is a thing that we'll give them as a trait, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Either way, they mostly live underground, but they can come above ground. Now let's think about their physical traits. Well, picture a worm, right? Worms are squishy, and that probably wouldn't make for good natural armor. So they're definitely going to be something that either utilizes things from underground to make armor for themselves. I would like them to have arms just because I don't know how they would do without them. But I also want them to slither on their tail. So think like a naga, or maybe like a snake that's kind of just up. That's what I'm thinking. I also was thinking of Earthworm Jim for a little bit. I was like, maybe they wear spacesuits, but that's silly. So let's just go with something kind of naga-like, and we'll keep that. But they do have arms, and they do have mouths, and they can talk. Now, as far as their history, I didn't have a whole lot of ideas about this, like what have they done in the past? But I started thinking, I'm like, would these things have just existed forever? They're kind of like a primordial concept. But then I started thinking, I'm like, maybe a little elemental, so maybe there's something there, and we're going to work that into our prompt, but I don't have a very good idea there. Are there cultural or religious practices that stand out? Well, I was thinking, okay, they're probably going to want to live together because they're going to be in a town underground, right? It's going to make sense to be safer in numbers. But as far as religion goes, I'm not sure that religion would really befit an underground kind of secluded group. I think that they'd probably see more benefit from each other than a deity. So I'll probably leave religion out of it, but I will make it so maybe they're like a close-knit group and everybody knows each other. Maybe there's like 30 people living in this town, Crawlorians, and that might be their culture. As for their architecture, I would see them just kind of living in holes. Maybe they've kind of dug out a dome, and then each one lives in little holes surrounding it. So when the players come upon this, they just see a big empty dome. As they walk in, they might find things, but be like, what happened here? All of a sudden, they're surrounded by all of these Crawlorians just coming out of the holes, and they don't know what to do. I liked that visual, so I'm going to go off of that. Relationships with other races. Now, if we think about conflict and harmony, I actually decided to make it challenging for myself, so I thought about what else is underground. Now, there's some monsters, but I didn't want to go underdark and go with like deep gnomes, so instead I went with just straight up dwarves. I figured that maybe the Crawlorians and the dwarves will work together to find minerals, the Crawlorians being able to move through the ground a little easier, and because they're going to have a burrowing speed, but also the dwarves and the Crawlorians working together. Maybe when they find stuff, they argue about who gets what. I don't know why I decided to make it so difficult on myself, but I want to make both the conflict and the harmony be with the same race. Signature traits and mechanics is something that's a little bit harder for me personally to do because although I have ideas, making sure it's balanced is important. So here's a few ideas I have. First, I wanted to start off with a negative because I do think that sunlight sensitivity that we mentioned earlier is important and it's flavorful. But then also I was like, okay, so what's the benefit? Well, let's think about a worm. They can get through small spaces, so maybe they don't need to squeeze, or they can fit through really small spots that other characters can't. That could be something cool that your DM could incorporate into an underground campaign for sure. All right, so we've got that. I also was thinking, I'm like, okay, they're a worm. They spend their entire time digging through the ground. Let's make it so that difficult terrain doesn't impact their movement speed. They already have a slower movement speed of 25 feet. So let's just do them a favor and difficult terrain does not impact their movement speed as long as it's, I don't know how we'll word it, but as long as it's not something like thorns, right? That's different. But then also they're underground and they're a race in D&D 5e, so they're going to have dark vision. Now, lastly, we have optional subraces and variants. So obviously, if we're going to have this be a race, we should kind of pre-make some different types of classes, essentially. So we'll just think about that as we go. That'll be something we more heavily utilize AI for once we've developed the race. Now that we've done all of our brainstorming, we have a better initial prompt than something just like, give me worm people. So this is going to be more what we have in mind. I am a dungeon master playing. Oh, by the way, this is all going to be public on the Patreon as well. So if you don't want to hear this part, just skip ahead about 20 seconds. I'm a dungeon master playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I'd like to create a new race in my game and would like help defining what makes them special. I would like the race to be called Crawlorians, which I still love that name. This is a series of questions and answers for consideration. Why does your world need this race? I would like a subterranean race that will exist between the surface world and the Underdark. Where do they live? They live beneath the ground, but are able to travel to the surface world. What are their physical traits? They should be humanoid worm people. Sounds weird. They should have arms and stand mostly upright, sliding along using their tails like a naga. What is their history? I don't have a good idea about their history, but I'd like them to be an ancient race with potential heritage from the elemental plane of Earth. That was something I came up with while I was kind of typing this out. Are there cultural or religious practices that stand out? I do not think that they would be very religious, but I am interested in you generating some cultural traditions. Architecture. These groups of Crawlorians gather in settlements of between 30 and 50. They excavate large domes underground and live within holes in the edge of that dome. They may have structures built from things that they could be found underground. Relationships with other races. Conflict. They are conflicted with dwarves as they both often harvest precious gems and minerals for both themselves and for sale to outsiders. Harmony. They will often work with the dwarves to find these minerals as they don't have the means to excavate them, but do have the means to locate them quicker. Signature traits and mechanics. The ability to squeeze into smaller spaces, a burrow speed of 15 feet, sunlight sensitivity which can be avoided with proper clothing, ability to traverse over difficult terrain related to the ground. Optional subraces and variations. This is something I would like your help on, so I'm just telling it to do it for me. Using these answers, add comprehensive details to the Crawlorians. Now there is an initial prompt. We now have a full description of the Crawlorians, subterranean wormfolk. Now this is obviously something that we can change things about, and that's actually very simple to do, and if there's anything I don't like, or even if there is, I'll change something just so you can kind of see what that's about. But I'm not going to sit here and read the whole thing. I will put this up on the Patreon, but I will go over some of the main points. So let's just start at the beginning, though. Origins and role in the world. The Crawlorians are a unique subterranean race that bridges the surface world and the depths of the Underdark. Their existence fills a niche between surface dwellers and the alien, often hostile creatures of the Underdark. Their worm-like anatomy and cultural traditions make them a fascinating addition, offering players the chance to explore life within Earth's crust. Now, if I'm putting this in a PDF for my players to consider reading or using, I'm going to change the wording here, of course. But it seems to have understood what I gave it as a prompt, right? So it gets it. Physical traits, they're about 5 to 6 feet upright, which is, just picture a 6-foot tall worm. Ridiculous. They could be up to 10 feet, including tail. So now we're dealing with a larger creature, which is interesting. That could cause some problems, but maybe not. Skin colors, that's cool. I hadn't considered that actually. So you can have brown, gray, or tan. They're a little glisteny, which is gross. And they live 120 to 150 years. Now, that's interesting. I actually wonder how long real worms live. In a ideal situation, because I always imagine that they don't live very long, but maybe they do. Obviously not 150 years, but their history is pretty cool. Basically, they came over from the elemental plane of Earth during a cataclysmic event where the boundary between the material and the elemental plane was thin. Makes sense. And then they evolved over time to live underground. Now, the culture and traditions is something I do want to check out because I had no good ideas. So earth weaving looks a lot like kind of what the giants do with stones, a form of geomantic artistry, shaping underground stone and minerals into sculptures. Okay, yeah, so it's very similar to the giants. Stone singing. They have developed a unique form of communication and storytelling called stone singing, where vibrations resonate through stone surfaces to transmit sound and meaning. It's both an art form and a practical means of long-distance communication underground. Okay, that makes some sense, actually. I do kind of like that. Maybe that could be something that you could use. I'm not sure how you'd use that in your game, but if you need to communicate over long distance, why wouldn't you just use message? But whatever, this is at least relevant. All right, burial rites. When Crawlorian dies, they are entombed in crystal caverns where their bodies become the seed for growing rare minerals. These burial sites are sacred and often fiercely protected. That's cool. All right, architecture. I kind of described this. Material structures are made from crystal, stone, and other underground resources, functional yet intricate, often incorporate. All right. So I'm actually probably going to ask for some more detail about some of the things that they would build, but we'll keep that in our back pocket here. Relationships with other races. So let's see how they figured this one out. So Crawlorians share a complicated relationship with dwarves. Both races seek Earth's treasures. However, their complementary skills create opportunities for... All right, so it doesn't really go into how to figure out that dynamic, but I guess that's on the DM, or you could just ask. Underdark races, they avoid Underdark denizens. That makes sense. And they see themselves as protectors, which is actually something I had in mind as well. Like, they're kind of this first line of defense against the Underdark coming up, or at the very least, they would be overrun if the Underdark did ever come up. So, makes sense that they would want to protect themselves. Surface dwellers, Crawlorians rarely venture to the surface, but trade minerals and gemstones with merchants brave enough to seek them out. Cool. All right, let's talk about the crunchy bits here. So signature traits and mechanics. So they have a +2 to Constitution and +1 to Wisdom. Now let's think about that for a second. So Wisdom and Constitution. Maybe the Wisdom is something that would help them to find these minerals, and Constitution is just because... I wouldn't think Constitution makes a ton of sense, though. Does it give a reason for that? Nah, it really doesn't. So... I don't think that they need to be particularly hardy individuals to live underground. I might actually ask it to change that to something that makes a little bit more sense. So that could be the piece that we decide to change. All right, they're medium. Their speed is 25 feet, 15 feet burrow speed. That makes sense. Dark vision, you can see in dim light. Sunlight sensitivity. Let's see how they figured this out. This effect can be mitigated by wearing protective clothing or goggles. Okay. Earthbound, you ignore difficult terrain caused by natural ground or stone. Perfect. Squeeze. Okay. 2 feet in diameter. That sounds good. You gain proficiency in the perception skill, and you have advantage on checks to detect minerals, stonework, or hidden underground structures. Okay, that's very similar to dwarves, and actually that makes a lot of sense. If you need to find something underground and you stop here, maybe that's how you convince them to help you, or they have the ability to help you, and now you need to convince them to. Okay, let's look at optional sub-races. So it gave us 3 different sub-races. I don't love the crystalkin, but we'll talk about this. So the physical traits of the crystalkin is that they're fairly translucent and they have crystalline growths along their tails and arms. But they gain a radiant resistance and the ability to cast a light cantrip. I get what they're going for there, but I just don't see that as being very useful. Like, if you are this underground creature and you already have dark vision, why do you want the light cantrip. I just don't think it makes sense. So we'll ask it to create another one of those. Stoneborn I do like. It's rugged, rocky skin that feels like sandstone, has +1 to strength and resistance to bludgeoning damage. Perfect. And then Tunnel Delver, which has a thinner body and enhanced sensory organs. It gains blind sight up to 10 feet and +10 feet burrow speed. That one makes a lot of sense too. I like that as well. So I had a lot of feedback here. This is a great start. By the way, I read an article the other day that said that it thinks it's pretty important to utilize manners when talking with an AI, as you actually, it's not like for some Skynet reason, but it was more that we tend to get better results when we're courteous, which I thought was very interesting. They had the data to back it up, so consider that when prompting. So this is a great start. I'd like to consider changing 3 things. I'd like you to elaborate more on the architecture, including things that would be built and why they would build them. Be sure to include forms of defense. I don't know that +2 Constitution makes a lot of sense for this creature, and I'd like you to justify why you picked Con and Wisdom as the stat boosts. After that, please suggest other stat boosts that could make sense and why. Lastly, I don't like the Crystalkin for Subrace. I don't think that it makes much sense to have a light cantrip underground for a race that has dark vision. Can you suggest an entirely new subrace? Well, it's certainly delivered, and you could get this kind of detail about any one of the main points that we talked about. So if you describe the way it looked and you're satisfied with it being 6 feet tall, blah, 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 that's great. But if you say, give me way more detail about the way they look, you're going to get paragraphs of everything about the way they look. So you could expand on anything or give it more detail yourself. All right, expanded architecture and defensive structures. So there's some central domes, living chambers, reservoirs, and wells. That makes sense. Defensive trenches and pitfalls. Echo chambers for communication. That makes sense knowing what we know about the one of their abilities that lets them, the stone singing. All right. Escape tunnels. That makes sense. Stone barricades and gates. Mining facilities. In settlements closer to mineral-rich areas, they build communal mining halls. Okay, maybe. I might leave that one out personally, only because we kind of established that they're not the ones gathering the resources, but it makes some sense. Maybe they're providing that for the dwarves. All right, the ability scores. Let's see why it picked what it did. The original selection of +2 Con was based on the Crawlorians' subterranean existence, suggesting they needed physical endurance to burrow and thrive in harsh underground environments. And Wisdom reflects their intuitive connection to the earth and their ability to detect dangers in the dark. Okay, like I get their reasoning, I just don't agree with it, but that's fine. We could do +2 dex, flexibility, okay. Wisdom makes sense because they are described as precise in movement and sensitive to vibrations, favoring a stealthy and okay, that's the dex. I still don't love that one. I get that a worm is probably pretty stealthy though. +2 intelligence, +1 dex has more to do with their geomancy. Okay, and then +1 strength, +2 wisdom. But wisdom remains key. Burrowing implies physical raw power. I'd be more inclined to do this one. +1 strength and +2 wisdom. Their worm-like physique might allow them to exert more physical force when digging or grappling. You know what? Let's go with the +1 strength and +2 wisdom. So I'll confirm that that's the one I like. And then new subrace suggestion is Tunnel Sworn. The Tunnel Sworn are secretive and highly specialized. It is hilarious to think of like a ninja worm. A subset of Crawlorians who dedicate themselves to defending their kind. Their adaptations make them expert ambushers and subterranean fighters. They have shadowed sight. You can see in darkness, both magical and non-magical. Wow. Burrowing speed increase. Ambusher, you have the advantage on attack rolls against creatures that haven't taken a turn in combat yet. Okay. And then Earth Meld. As an action, you can partially submerge yourself into stone or earth. Wow, this is a little overpowered, I think. Thank you. I'd like to confirm the third choice for stats, +1 strength, +2 wisdom. Just to make sure that we're in a good state, would you consider this race to be balanced with existing official races in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition? If not, what would you change? Now, this is good. It talks about the strengths here, and it does go over the features. It mentions that burrow speed could potentially be very useful and potentially unbalanced, depending on which scenario you're in. It mentions that we might be going a little too far with giving them the ability to overcome the sunlight sensitivity, and although it kind of makes some sense, I like that idea. Maybe we'll pare back the ability to circumvent that and instead make it just sunlight sensitivity. It does point out a potential imbalance of burrow speed plus earthbound plus squeeze creates a combination of exploration advantages that could overshadow the situational abilities of other races like elves, dwarves, or tabaxi. Interesting. Sunlight sensitivity as a drawback might not always feel meaningful, especially if players know how to mitigate it quickly. Okay, so I do think I'll get rid of the constraints around sunlight sensitivity. I do think it's important to ask it to make sure things are balanced, because it has a whole lot of things to compare against. So it does say adjust the burrow speed, keep burrowing but make it down to 10. Okay, that makes it more of like an out of combat thing, which makes some sense, because 15 feet to just immediately dive straight down does feel a little powerful. So I like that too. Refine sunlight sensitivity. While in direct sunlight, you have disadvantage on attack rolls and perception checks that rely on sight regardless of protective clothing. Okay. That might be so tough to want to play though, because a lot of things are going to happen above the surface. So I guess that's up to the player, right? You just make it an option. Streamlined traits combine Earthbound and Squeeze into a single trait. Subterranean Grace. You ignore difficult terrain caused by ground or stone and can move through spaces as small as 2 feet in diameter without squeezing. This condenses the mechanic without losing flavor. That makes sense. And then limit stone sense. Instead of advantage, consider granting proficiency in perception or investigation for detecting stonework and minerals. This matches other similar racial abilities. Okay, so now it gives me the revised traits for balance, which, I just kind of went over. With these changes, blah, 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 would you like to implement them? Yes, I would. I really hope that this ended up being useful to you. Obviously, it was a bit of a silly example, but that was kind of the point. I think if you have a good idea, you could do a lot with this style of thinking and utilizing AI to help you brainstorm. That's kind of what I'm trying to promote here, is shouldn't be doing all the work for you. It should be helping you with the parts that suck. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining me here on Dungeons & Drams. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Cheers.